book, painful book. Basically, it is a discussion, actually an argument between one man, and God. Have you ever felt like you wanted to talk to God? Have you ever felt like you don't like the way God's doing stuff? Have you ever gotten mad at God and wanted to just yell at Him? That's Habakkuk. He had had enough. And he got angry and he went up to the top of the temple, the pinnacle, the highest, 25, 30 stories high. And he said, God, if you're up there, I've had it. You and I need to talk. And an amazing thing is God talked back and said, what is bothering you now? Mr. Cranky Pants. And Habakkuk laid it all out. Said, I don't like this, I don't like that, I don't like this, and I don't like that. And it's your fault, you're a lousy God. Well, that's putting on some mighty big boots, if you ask me. Especially since you're 20, 30 stories in the air. And you could go, okay, boop. But that's what he does, and it's the most impressive little book. And I don't know why God put it in the Bible, but it's here. Maybe it is to show us that He will deal with arrogance. He will deal with ignorance, but He won't deal with indifference. God would rather have you mad at Him than not giving Him any time at all. He can deal, like I said, if you're ignorant, He can teach you. If you're arrogant, He can tame you. But if you're indifferent and will have nothing to do with Him, then He'll have nothing to do with you. And the Scriptures make that quite plain. There is no sin in the world He can't forgive except indifference. When you say, who needs it? You say that to God, ooh, buddy, you are in some kind of trouble. And it never ends well, ever. Well, Habakkuk was angry. Habakkuk was also ignorant. He didn't like what God was doing, but he didn't really fully understand what God was doing. So God said, let me explain it to you. After which then, upon that revelation, Habakkuk had a whole new perspective on things. Okay, the year is roughly around 587, 589 BC. Here's my map of Jerusalem, my map of the Holy Land. Jerusalem was around here. The northern kingdom was destroyed, as we saw in Jonah and Nahum. The southern kingdom was still okay, but it was getting worse by the minute, and that's because all the good kings like Uzziah and Jehoshaphat and those guys have all died. And they put in Jeroboam and some other something for about 2 or 3 of them that were really terrible. And they said, we don't need God. We got a large, wonderful standing army, and we don't have to fear anything. Until the Babylonians came down. And they came and they swept around every place, and they laid siege to Jerusalem. That's after they destroyed everything around it. So all the lifelines, all the food sources, all the supplies and materials were cut off. The last holdout was the stronghold of Jerusalem, of course, which had giant walls all the way around it and all that stuff. It was a fortress, and it was built that way. Here's a little fun fact. I don't know if it's fun, but it's a fact. You know what Jerusalem means? The word Jerusalem? It means place of peace. The most conquered city in the whole world is Jerusalem. More battles have been fought over this hunk of rock than anybody else. Countries and nations, everybody and their mothers wanted to destroy it for some reason. It is perfectly perched between 2 giant valleys. These are the 2 giant valleys, and then Jerusalem is built up here on top of this mountain. This is a mountain here. I'm not a very good artist, but this is the Kidron Valley. Over here is another mountain, and this was the Garden of Gethsemane, or the Mount of Olives, where Jesus would go to pray and get arrested. This side was the beautiful gate, which after Jesus would go down the Kidron Valley, come back up this hill through and enter the eastern gate of the city. That was called the Beautiful Gate, and after Jesus died, the Christians walled this gate up because Jesus prophesied, and it's written about in the Revelation, that this gate shall remain closed until the coming of the Savior. When he returns, he will come in the clouds in glory and reopen that gate and re-enter the city and go to the temple of Jerusalem. So to this day, 2021 or 20, whatever it is, 19, if you went over to Jerusalem and visited the city, this eastern gate is still walled up. It is closed. Of course, all the other gates are open to the city. Anyway, that was the Kidron Valley. This is the Gihon Valley. This is Israel's garbage dump over here. When they produce garbage and all that, they throw it into this valley, and this valley literally burns all the time. It's just one big giant dump, and it burns, and it's terrible, and it's nasty, and it's stinky. And this is why when they reference hell in the Bible, it's always Gehenna or Gihon, which is, they're referencing this valley that burns with fire without end, where the worm is never destroyed, where there's only filth, decay, and rot. So when they reference hell, it's always that, Gehenna or Gihon. It's not Hades. You know, I see Hades in there all the time, but that's not hell. When they mention Hades, they're not talking about hell. They're talking about, when they talk about hell, they're talking about that valley. Anyway, they thought it would be a good idea to build the city up here, and it's an easy mark for any of the soldiers coming this way or coming this way. They thought the valleys would protect them on each side, but then again, not really. So that's basically the layout of Jerusalem here. And the Babylonians were coming, sweeping down from the north. They also came around the Sea of Galilee, and they're sweeping up from the south. So the city is besieged, and it is all the way around circled with roughly about 200,000 soldiers, which is, in that day and age, enormous of an army. I mean, that's just ridiculous to have 200,000 soldiers. I mean, today countries have, 3 million standing soldiers, but that was not the case at 589 BC. It took roughly 3 to 4 years to starve the city out, and that's exactly what they would do. They would just sit out there and camp every day, and if anyone tried to leave the city, of course, they'd catch them and kill them. But it took about 4 years until where finally the people were literally, and I don't want to be gross, but they're eating their own children. You two look out. Cucaracha looks hungry. And that's what was happening. Everything, every little rat or mice was food, and they were just starving to death. And finally, the day would come where the siege walls would go up. And of course, the Babylonians poured into the city like a tide coming over a breaker. And everything was destroyed. They burned the temple to the ground. They killed all the men. The children, probably around 7 or 8 and younger, they kept. Not the babies. The babies were destroyed. But anywhere, children, if you were like 5 to 10 years old, you might have had a chance. Because they would take them back to Babylon as slaves, and they would raise them as their own Babylonian, and that would be the remnant when the Jews go into exile for 70 years. It was mostly young women and young men, one of which was Daniel, of course. You've read that in the book of Daniel before. He and his 3 buddies, they were all young kids, probably 8, 9, 10 years old, and made the journey back to Babylon and grew up there under Nebuchadnezzar. All right? This is the historical period. If you remember, these 2 kingdoms were destroyed in about 789 themselves, these 2. But for 200 years, Israel had good kings up until the final death of Uzziah and Jehoshaphat and those guys. Once they were gone, this city fell into the same sins that these guys did. It was just horrible. If you want to know how horrible it is, read Ezekiel. Ezekiel was another young man that was taken to exile back over here. And when he was over here, God took him in the spirit back to Jerusalem because he asked God, why? What did they do that deserved this kind of utter destruction? And God takes him back even into the very Holy of Holies inside the temple. And he, for himself, views what was actually going on. The blasphemies and the horrors and the human worship and the human sacrifice and all that stuff that God just prohibited was going on in the temple at Jerusalem. That's why it had to be destroyed. They defamed it so badly. Ezekiel never knew that, so he asked God, and then God showed him, and then he went back there. He goes, now we got a job for you to do. We got to rebuild this thing. And I want every stone burned. I want everything that was ever used before not used anymore. And we'll bring in new stone. We'll cut down new timbers. We'll cut new cedars. We'll rebuild the temple with the remnant of my people. And then under a man named Zerubbabel, of course, God brought them back. And they began construction on the temple. Now, the temple they built, of course, was nothing like the Solomonic temple. That was huge and gorgeous and beautiful and golden and everything. Theirs looked more like a restroom in a state park. Which if you've ever seen those are not wonderful. But that's what they had and would have for another 500 years until a guy named Herod came along, and Herod said, I'm going to rebuild that sucker. And he did. And he built it to what the glory it was in the day of Rome, until Rome destroyed it in about 55 AD. So the temple was destroyed in 589. It was destroyed again in 55 AD. And it is not rebuilt to this day, but Revelation tells us it will be rebuilt before the Lord comes again and opens this eastern gate, the beautiful gate, to enter the city of peace and once and for all establish the kingdom of God on Mount Zion. Now, that's if you believe this God stuff. Well, he's already proven it twice, so I'm figuring that third time probably going to happen, just like he said it would. Okay, so that's part of in the future there, guys, if you want to look ahead. But it's during this time when things are going so very bad, that which Ezekiel did not see, Habakkuk's got a front row seat for. And he's watching it go very bad, and he's not liking what he's seeing. And he says, somebody's got to talk to God. The priests are all corrupt. They're not talking to him. God's not talking to them. I will do it. So he climbs the temple, the pinnacle of the temple, gets all the way up there, the highest point in the city, and says, and screams literally, angrily to God, saying, we need to talk. I don't like what you're doing. I got a bad feeling about this whole thing. And the Lord basically confirms that and says, well, if I were you, I'd have a bad feeling about what you're saying. Because what's happening is a bad thing. And of course Habakkuk didn't understand either. He said, why? Why? Welcome to the book of Habakkuk. It's a real buffer. Well, let's have chips. I saw a bag in the kitchen. All right, turn to chapter 1. We'll look at chapter 1. The oracle. We translate that word oracle. That's not really fair. A better translation for the word would probably be burden or heavy load. Or, the worst problem you can imagine. This is if I was saying to Cucaracha, and I said, what's the matter? Oh, I have a burden. All my kids have run off and joined the circus. And Tim dumped me for a younger woman, and he took my car and my car keys, and I had no job, and nobody understands what I'm talking about. And I would say, I don't either, but, write it slowly. And she says, I have just a terrible burden. Everything in her life is wrong. That's a better way to translate that. So that's what Habakkuk's saying. He literally was the first one in the history of humankind to say, it can't get any worse. And of course God answered, oh, sure can. Watch this. So when you're feeling down and out or aggravated or hopeless, you got nothing on Habakkuk. Nothing. The oracle or the burden which Habakkuk the prophet knew. How long, O Lord, will I stand and call for help? How long wilt thou not hear me? I cry out to thee, there's violence, yet thou dost not save. Why do you make me see this iniquity, this sin, this horror? Why do you cause me to look upon all this wickedness? Yes, destruction and violence are always before me. Strife and contention arises everywhere, and the law, which is God, the whole law that governs the society, the law is completely ignored. Justice is never upheld, and the wicked surround the righteous. Therefore, even justice comes out perverted. He's complaining a little bit. Mm-hmm. And he's blaming it on God. Well, the Lord answers and says, Habakkuk, look amongst the nations and observe. Be astonished and wonder, because I am doing something even now in your days. You would not believe it if you were told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, a fierce and impetuous people. They march throughout the whole of the earth to seize dwelling places which are not theirs. They are dreaded and feared, and their justice and authority originate with their swords and themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards and keener than wolves in the evening. Their horsemen come galloping. Their horsemen come from afar and fly like the eagle swooping down to devour its prey. All of them have come for violence. Their horde of faces moves ever forward. They collect captives like sand, and they mock at any king. Their rulers are a laughing matter, and they laugh at every fortress they come upon and heap up rubble to capture it. And they will sweep through like the wind and pass on, but they will be held guilty, they whose strength is their own God. Wow. Habakkuk said, why aren't you doing something? He said, I am. Look out over the walls of the city. Tell me what you see. 200,000 armed, bloodthirsty Chaldeans or Babylonians coming to destroy you. And there's nothing that's going to stop them. Nothing. Not a force this huge. Not a force this mighty. They've stripped everything clean. Anyway, that's not really the answer Habakkuk wanted to hear. Habakkuk wanted to hear, well, I'll clean up the priests, I'll put the temple back together, I'll make everything nice and sweet, and you can go home to your safe space, put on a couple of baby pins, and get some rest, and everything will be sweet and nice. That's not what it said. God said, oh, I am the good son. Look out over the walls and tell me what you see. That must have been a sight that would bring any man to his knees, to see that and to hear that God is making it happen. Habakkuk asks back to God. He screams back, art thou not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? And it's in the interrogative. He's questioning. Aren't you God? Aren't you my Holy One, my Lord? We will not die, shall we? O Lord, thou hast appointed them to judge us, and thou, O rock, hast established them to correct us. Thine eyes are too pure to approve this evil. Thou canst look upon all this wickedness with favor. Why dost thou look with favor upon these who deal treacherously? Why art thou silent when the wicked swallow us up? Those who are more righteous than they? You're allowing the ugly, evil, nasty barbarians to kill us who are righteous? Why hast thou made men like the fish of the sea, like the creeping things without a ruler over them? The Chaldeans bring all of them up with a hook. They drag them away in their nets. They gather them together in their fishing net. Therefore they rejoice and they are glad, because therefore they offer a sacrifice to themselves and their nets. And they burn incense to their fishing nets, because through these things their catch is enormous, and their food is plentiful. Will they therefore empty their nets and continue to slay nations, never sparing? What do you think about this? Well, he acknowledges the fact that there's no stopping this force. Obviously Habakkuk has heard of the Chaldeans. They come and they just swoop up everything and they destroy it, and then they pay homage to themselves, to their own strength. Their God is their own sword arm.
Person complains that Lord's not doing anything, sometimes he is doing it not the way he thinks it should.
And these people are nastier than they. You know, that's an interesting theory. In seminary, there was a class, and it's called the Theology of Sin. Isn't that amazing? The Theology of Sin. Well, our pulpits are pretty silent on it. Nobody talks about it anymore. I've always used a characterization myself of sin. This is the tree of life, okay? And sin is and this is God, of course. God provides the tree of life. And sin is actually an archery term. That means we separate ourselves from God. As long as we're holding fast to the tree of life right here and just loving God, and hearts going up and all that stuff, and we're in the shade and we're having a picnic and everything is wonderful in our lives. Sin is what separates us from God. But you got to account for God's mercy. Well, God's mercy sometimes is this chain which is bolted to the tree of life, to which we are desperately hanging on to because of the fires of doom and death and destruction down here are raging. All right, theology of sin. Sin got us wondering and looking over to where we fell. God's mercy at least gave us something to hang on to for a moment. Now comes the time of decision. How many of these links got to break before we plummet to our death? Just one. I mean, logic would tell you that, right? Just one. This link, we'll call that the sin of a lie. How about this one up here? That's stealing. Or this is not honoring your mom or dad. This is, sexual perversion. Whatever. Pick a sin. Doesn't matter. Pick a sin. What is sin, Tom? Well, we know it's that which separates God from man. God is the tree of life. Without God, there is no life. There's only destruction. So if you separate yourself from that which gives life, then what is the alternative? Well, destruction, basically, or a slow, miserable death. And you don't have to say, see, what we do is we say, we compare it. We say, well, Barbara says I might have lied, but boy, she's killed somebody. She murdered. So Lee is a lot worse off on murder here than I am for lying. But the problem is you each are hanging on to your own chains. And if lie's on that chain somewhere and you lied, what happens?
It's a broken chain.
Your history. If she murdered, what happens?
It's a broken chain.
Same thing. Now, let me ask you a question. If you lied and your chain broke, and you murdered and your chain broke, and you both plummeted into destruction, which one of you is more dead? Kind of ridiculous to say, well, she's a liar. Well, she's a murderer. Whoa, dude. That's what I call relative righteousness. You know what, Jeremy? You'll always look good as long as your brother is raggedier than you. So hang around the raggedy brother and you will always look good. Right? That's what skinny people do. We hang around fat people. Why? Because I look good. And I got two giant, double beef patties on each side of me. That doesn't make me thinner. It doesn't make you more righteous. And it doesn't prevent either one of you from hitting the ground and dying. See, we call that relative righteousness somewhat tongue-in-cheek in seminary. Relative righteousness means you'll always look righteous as long as you've got some relatives that are raggedier than you. But the the reality is, we all got our own chain, and we got to ask ourselves, do we want to be separated from God? If we do, this is our decision right here. I always say it, heaven or hell is like the second window at McDonald's. What do you mean by that, Tom? Well, what I mean by that is if you order a Big Mac and fries at the first window, what do you expect at the second? Don't get to the second window and say, well, I'd rather have Mac fish. Well, you didn't order a Mac fish. You ordered a Big Mac and fries. So what are you going to get? If sin separates us from God, and God is the only provider of life, and we blow that off, then what are we going to find at that second window?
We ordered it up.
It's that simple. God makes it quite plain throughout the world, throughout the gospel. Jesus says you can't serve two masters. You're either going to honor God, live for God, love God, keep yourself tied to God, or you're not. You're going to blow him off. God can forgive the lying. God can forgive the murder if the heart is penitent. But he won't forgive the people who blow him off. That's the one sin he can't forgive, where God becomes unimportant. Like I said, God can deal with ignorance. Oh, I didn't know it was a lie. God can deal with arrogance. Well, he killed my brother, so I killed him. He can't deal with indifference. I don't care. Well, you'll have about 1 second, which will last an eternity, to care once that chain is broken and you're on your way down. There's a reason God calls his coming, his return, the great and terrible day. Why do you think that is? Hundreds of times in the scriptures, the coming of the Lord is referred to as the great and terrible day. Do you ever wonder why?
Great are the ones that are found in him, and it's terrible for the ones that are not found.
Those who rejoice are those who are hanging on to that tree. Now Jesus, we upped him a little bit better. He said, well, not so much the tree of life, but the rock of ages. Still depicting that immovable object, which grants us life as long as we hang on to it. But it's the same imagery. Terrible for those who have either let go or refused to keep their chain strong. Age-old expression, we're no stronger than our weakest link, right? They used to have a game show called The Weakest Link. The only thing in the world where we celebrated the idiot in the crowd. I often wondered what those game contestants who were found to be the weakest link, I often wondered what they were thinking or what they were feeling when they were going home. When they were found to be the biggest idiot and they're going home. I mean, their chain broke. They fell. They're done. I wonder if they ever sat quietly and thought to myself, man, am I that much of a loser? Is there no hope for me? Is there no redemption for me? The prophets are hanging on to this and things. Even the flames that are touching their feet, they're screaming out to God, Lord, pull me. If there's any way, pull me. The sinner that went into the temple wouldn't even raise his eyes to heaven. But he said, Lord, if there's any way, pardon me, a sinner. And Jesus said that man was pulled up that day. Even the guy on the cross dying next to Jesus, breathing his very last, said, Lord, if it's possible, remember me in your kingdom. Up he went. Jesus said, it's possible. And, these are the imageries. We read these stories, we read these scriptures, and we don't think nothing about it. Well, Habakkuk is the guy right here, right now, and his chains are breaking. And he's screaming out to God. How many of you have ever questioned God's doings? I think I have before. I say, what in the heck are you doing, Lord? First of all, he questions God's mercy. Oh, you're going to question God on something. I don't know that it would be his mercy, particularly when it's by his mercy you're still hanging on to that chain. He questions God's mercy. How can you just sit and watch while we're going to be destroyed and overrun? How can you use these bloodthirsty, barbarian, godless people to kill us? We're the chosen race. He questions God's methods. I don't like what you're doing. I don't like how you're doing it. How many of you would go into your boss and say that? Would he look with favor on you? And finally, oh man, as if Habakkuk hasn't dug himself in deep enough, then he questions God's judgment. D-G-E. Always had trouble with that word, with that hidden D in there. He questions God's judgment. Basically, he's saying, I don't think what you're doing is right. This is a God who's always right, who never lies, who never makes a mistake. And this guy, little weenie Habakkuk, up on the 30th floor overlooking the balcony, says, you ain't right, God. Wow. Wow. To question God's mercy, you say you're merciful. I don't think you are. You say you know everything right, how to do it. I don't think your methods are very good. You could have cleaned this town up a little bit better than by bringing out 200,000 soldiers. And I sure don't like how it's going to end. We're going to be slaughtered by these guys because that's what they do. How many of you have ever gotten in God's face and argued with him like that? And see, Habakkuk wasn't even quite aware of what was going to happen. God's the one that told him, oh, I'm doing something. Don't worry about it. I'm going to take care of the wickedness of this city. He says, how? He says, look over the walls. Tell me what you see. Well, that's not the answer Habakkuk wanted to hear. So you want to confront God? You want to get in God's face? He'll let you. But be wary of his answers. You ever see that show, Last Man Standing? Kind of funny. And his wife's always yelling at Mike, the guy, Tim Allen. And she says, why do you do that? Why do you do that? And he has a standard answer he uses a lot. And it's, don't ask questions you really don't want the answer for. You ever hear him say that? It says a lot. Don't ask questions you don't really want the answers for. Well, don't get in God's face and question his mercy, his methods, his kindness, his judgment, his motivation, and then stand there and say, well, I don't like that. It's really not up for debate. When God created the world, it wasn't up for debate. He said, let it be, and it was. When God destroyed nations, he said, these guys are going down, and it was. It wasn't up for debate. It didn't go to a council meeting. And when God created you, he didn't say, let's talk about Barb. Oh, he called you Barb before you were Barb. You were still just a little bit of goo. But it wasn't up for debate. Barb was on her way.
No, it's supposed to have been Rebecca from my mother and dad's.
Could have been Habakkuk. The point is, don't ask questions you don't want the answer for. Habakkuk did that. In one way, God honored him. In another way, God said, you know what, little fella? I need to tell you a single truth. If you learn nothing else out of this, learn this. You're not God. I am. If you learn nothing else, learn that. Now, whether you fall or whether you live, that's up to you. But you're not God. This argument has just started. It's going to get more funner. In the second chapter and then the third chapter, holy moly, it hits the proverbial fan. Okay? Pick it up next week. I told you it wasn't a real happy book.